Hi, I'm Kathy Smith, Director of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society here at Community College of Philadelphia. In today's Perspectives interview, David Travaskis, Center Board Member and Pro Bono Counsel to the PA Bar, speaks to Robert Cavalier. Dr. Cavalier is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he directs the Program for Deliberative Democracy at the Center for Ethics and Policy. That center is a key partner for the Center for Law and Society here at Community College. In partnership with Dr. Cavalier, we have offered deliberative democracy conversations on marriage, climate change, and most recently on abortion. I think you'll find learning about this process as fascinating as I do.
Hello. Welcome to the Perspective series of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society. I'm David Travaskis, an adjunct professor here in the Paralegal Studies program of the Community College of Philadelphia. Today's guest is Robert Cavalier, a professor from the Carnegie Mellon University. Good to have you here in Philadelphia, sir.
Well, my pleasure.
And we're going to jump right in. You do something which is called deliberative democracy. What is deliberative democracy?
Well, I think it's important to realize that deliberative democracy is not a democracy in which everybody is talking, but rather it is instantiated in a set of very specific protocols that are informed by the social sciences but not driven by them. In essence, those protocols require some attempt to have an inclusive group of people come together, providing that group with some well-vetted background information on a particular topic, whether it be the 2016 Pittsburgh budget or whether it be a proposed marriage protection amendment. And with that background information, they have a chance to become informed about the topic. Then you want to have them sit in roundtable settings with trained moderators, 5 or 6 together, and to start to discuss the topic in a well-structured way. Moderators try to take the groups through a particular sequence in order, maybe the history, maybe the law, and eventually getting people to tell stories that inform others about their perspective. And in fact, storytelling is one of the ways in which people can get into other people's shoes, and it's extremely effective.
Now, this sounds a little bit like a community forum. Is it that?
It would certainly contrast with traditional town hall meetings. A town hall meeting is essentially an opportunity for people to show up at 7 o'clock in the evening on a Tuesday night to discuss the budget with a panel from the city. Those town hall meetings tend to be focused on the dreaded microphone and the 7 angry citizens who stand up. They tend to be a highly self-selected group, and over time they seem to have become more and more dysfunctional. If we can redesign the town hall meeting and the community meeting, frankly, to be more well-structured in such a way as to allow people to have conversations with people they don't usually speak to see perspectives they generally haven't heard, and to come to some kind of consensus about questions that they want to ask a panel. Those questions then are well vetted, and they tend not to be irrelevant or free-wandering or aggressive. And the panel then has an opportunity to address those questions to everybody in the room, which is part of what you want. But then they can return to their tables, reflect a little bit on the answers and on their own discussions, and fill out an exit survey. And the survey will allow you, whether it's a community discussion or a statewide discussion, the survey will allow you to capture what people think about an issue once they've had a chance to become informed about it, discuss it amongst themselves and with experts. And that's the essence of a deliberative democracy, which can also be called a strong democracy.
Now, this deliberative democracy, you take issues, you take topics, What are some of the issues that you've looked at?
Very often the issues will sort of announce themselves. They'll emerge either, let's say, on a campus setting with certain concerns that the campus seems to be expressing. In Carnegie Mellon a number of years ago, we had a public art piece that was appeared one day. And students were very confused about it. Faculty were very angry about it. It hadn't been well vetted. It was obviously expensive. And once installed, it wasn't going to go away. That led to a campus conversation on public art. And in the process of doing that, we worked with the various colleges on campus to provide a kind of interdisciplinary perspective on the whole issue of public art. Students came together with faculty in that case and had a very, very informed conversation about the role of public art on the campus, both now and in the future. The administration took that conversation to heart and engineered some of the public art policies. That's a good example of an issue coming up under discussion, having an actual influence on policy, because the discussion was, in fact, well thought through. And again, just as in public settings, on-campus settings, you can have a town hall meeting and it can turn into frustration, anger, or superficiality with a PowerPoint presentation and people wanting to basically agree with it. So we find that both on campus conversations, if they're well structured, and community conversations, even at the neighborhood level or the city level or even the state level, this way of redesigning the forum in which people can have a deliberation, right, has a strong impact not only on the consequences with regard to the opinions that are formed, but also on the individuals who participate in that. We find in our exit surveys that people will say over and over again, knowing what I know now, I would have done this again. I will be more engaged in my community as a result of that. So we are also able, with this model of democracy, to counter some of the current sort of winds in our current democratic setting, some of which come from political science, which tells us that for the average citizen, it's rational to be ignorant because you don't have the time to spend on learning, let's say, proposed cuts in Medicaid at the state level, and the fact that your vote will, in fact, be unable to sway the final decision. On a cost-benefit analysis, it's not worth it. People get their opinions then through 30-second advertisements. Those provide cues. And in our sort of model of democracy, which is vote-centric, the key is to get the most amount of votes. And that, frankly, as long as it's legal, allows for agenda-setting manipulation and framing of the type that we see in our current sort of political discourse. Deliberative democracy can both identify this as a problem and provide a solution to it.
Now, you have done some of these deliberative democracy processes here at Community College in Philadelphia.
Yes, and in fact, my own background in higher education involved a period of time when I worked at Community College of Allegheny County. And I was back then and still today am very respectful of the care and attention that community colleges takes with regard to its students, and that in fact it is a community college. So it is in a certain sense perhaps even better primed to be a location for these kinds of conversations. Years ago I had a chance to meet Kathy Smith and some of your colleagues, and when we were taking up a proposed marriage protection amendment coming out of the Pennsylvania State Legislature, we wanted to use the gold standard in deliberative democracy, which was developed by Jim Fishkin and which is called a deliberative poll. A deliberative poll requires a random sample of the population so that you have statistical robustness with regard to the outcomes.
So how did you get a random sample here at Community College?
We worked with the University of Pittsburgh Survey Research Center, which does the random digit dialing. We got voter registration rolls from the counties surrounding 4 sites across the state. And Philadelphia was one, and the community college here was the host site, the location for that. On the basis of that, we were able to recruit about 400 people. Approximately 276 showed up for the event across the state.
So you randomly select 400 people from our location, you invite them all to come to Community College, and when you did the one on the Marriage Protection Act,
yes,
270 showed up.
270 showed up across the entire state. We
Oh,
had
across
4
the whole
sites,
state.
Carnegie Mellon, Shippensburg, and Slippery Rock at the time.
And the community college
And
here.
the community college at the time.
So what happens for that 270? What are they doing when they get here?
Right. They receive a packet of information ahead of time. During the actual phone calls, and that is part of the recruitment status, we get some demographic information, and we also get a chance to ask them some questions about knowledge and about their attitudes. In this case, with regard to the Marriage Protection Amendment or same-sex marriage.
Right, and that amendment was to ban same-sex marriage.
It was to basically create a constitutional amendment that would prohibit same-sex marriage and that would not recognize anything functionally equivalent like civil unions. In the process of asking people their initial opinions about this, we are capturing them in the same way that a Gallup poll would capture them. We capture them in the midst of their own friends, their own television statements, their own world, their own bubble. And the pre-survey is actually useful in that regard because then it allows us to measure any impact of the information and the conversation when we have a post-survey. And that's why I speak of it as the gold standard, because for the Fishkin model, you do have that random sample coming in, you have a random sample then having a conversation, and you have a random sample then filling out the post-survey.
So let's say I was one of the 270 who had been selected. I would have gotten a package of materials.
Yes.
I would have read it or not read it, depending on my personal inclination. And then I would have shown up, let's say at my site was Community College of Philadelphia.
Yes.
What happens then?
Sure. In the invitation, we do have somewhat of a contract. We do request that they really take seriously the background materials, and those are well vetted. People will show up at 8:30 in the morning. The registration begins at 9. They're then broken up into groups with trained moderators. We have seen over and over again that people come in as individuals with preferences, and by 10 o'clock in the morning they become citizens with judgment. It's important that we craft these kinds of deliberations around problems to work on, not issues to debate. So the problem was the details of the Marriage Protection Amendment and a comparison of the Massachusetts Supreme Court argument and the Vermont Civil Union. Along the way, they became familiar with the history of marriage and the intersection of marriage and society and law, Loving v. Virginia, for example. And along the way then, they overcame not only rational ignorance, the desire not to learn, but they also discovered and overcame a lot of legal illiteracy because they were able to see the cases and see the arguments, et cetera.
And they're doing that with a trained moderator. So they're working through materials that are provided, and they're in groups. And you used a turn of phrase. They come as individuals with sort of their own preferences. And you said within an hour or so of doing this, they are now citizens
with judgment.
With judgment. What's the difference there?
So one of the things that the moderator begins with is what's called a greeting, at which point the people who don't usually talk to each other and don't know each other begin to sort of see each other as persons, and they hear stories. And indeed, in the process of the storytelling, as they go into the topic itself, someone will say, well, you know, I have a cousin and he lives with the same man and they seem to be fine, et cetera. And that, again, is one way for people to get into other people's shoes. They start to actually form a little community. There's laughter, there's conversation, and I would say, even with a topic like what we call today same-sex marriage, we saw people have a conversation about sex, religion, and politics without really going at each other. We should all do as well on our Thanksgiving dinners.
Yes.
Now, it is also part of the process that at the end of the first hour of discussion, the moderator will ask people to come as a table and achieve consensus on 2 questions to ask an expert panel. So there may have been an issue that came up in the table that wasn't in the background material, and there was uncertainty about it. That's the only time we're asking people to come to consensus.
So we have talked for an hour. We have materials that we've worked on before we came. We've been shepherded through this discussion by a trained moderator.
Yes.
And now as a group, we're coming up with 2 questions that we're asking an expert panel.
Yes.
A panel that's expert on this topic of same-sex marriage or whatever the topic is.
That's correct. A loop, if you will, with an expert panel is an important element of these kinds of public policy discussions. The panelists themselves are chosen because they do have practical wisdom and detailed knowledge of a particular area like law, like psychology, sort of religious perspectives.
Now, are these panelists advocates for certain positions?
No, it's important to see that the panelists themselves are asked to act as teachers and not as pundits. We don't want to model the debate society that we tend to see. There's an important difference between
So this
debate
is in Fox News and
deliberation.
MSNBC. This is a presentation of a balanced and neutral teacher.
That's correct. The debate model requires a winner and a loser at some point. And so you are simply trying to make points. Within the deliberative model, we want people to convey as much information as possible. And once that is done, and in the plenary session, each table has chosen a person at the table to stand up. And the moderator for the panel will say, table number 1, what is your question? By the way, this begins to sort of create a community within the entire room. You often start to get some humor appearing and then some laughter. And again, a remarkable contrast to the traditional town hall meeting. At the end of the panel discussion, they reflect, and then they fill out a survey. The survey is designed to capture quantitative information in terms of is this important, not important, and qualitative information. Tell us a story, give us an insight into the reasons why you chose this particular point to be considered important. So you're getting reasoned explanations, and the end result of this is what Daniel Lankovich at Public Agenda has called public judgment, and he wants to distinguish it from mass opinion. We had mass opinion going in through the pre-survey. We have public judgment coming out. And because of that, and if you get a supermajority, then the results of these deliberative polls have consulting power. They're not like California referendum where they create policy. They can only recommend, but that recommending force can be used to influence public policy.
Now, when you did this one on same-sex marriage,
Yes.
Did you get that kind of supermajority consensus at the end?
Yes, actually, within that particular event across the state, 70% felt that there should be some form of legal recognition of same-sex marriage. They did divide evenly between marriage per se and civil union. So 70% said there should be some form of legal recognition for same-sex couples, I should say. And they did split, however, between marriage. But
And you were doing this a few years ahead of the court decisions, which have now legalized that.
That's correct. And it's also important to know that our median age was 54 years old. So we had a representative sample of the state and indeed that was modeled in the older participants, which again put us further ahead and showed us where things could be going if in fact you created the conditions for that kind of deliberation. As some people at the time were concerned that we had to let a whole generation die away before we could deal with this issue, we were able to show that if you gave them the right tools, they could in fact form a judgment that was consistent with where the youth was coming from.
Now, this whole process is such a different way of looking at things than what most of our audience thinks about when they think about political issues. They think about people basically getting up, saying their position, and telling the other side why they're wrong about their position. What are the roots of it? Because this comes out of life experiences, doesn't it?
Many of the conversations provide people with other viewpoints that they would not have thought about. I remember one conversation which was about public transportation and cuts in bus routes. And one woman said, if they cut this bus route to Ross Township, I will not be able to go to my second job. If I can't go to my second job, then I'm going to have to go on welfare. And someone who never rode a bus in his life was astounded by that and came to see that in ways that that person would not have if they were simply thinking about the issue themselves. So that's an incredible, very important part. But another element of this that's important is the pragmatic and practical way of actually employing this. We have found in the city of Pittsburgh, for example, that the new mayor, Mayor Peduto, has seen these forums as a way to get informed opinion that go beyond the traditional town hall meetings, to the point where the selection of the police chief in Pittsburgh was in fact done through deliberative forums. There were 6 separate police zones around the city. Each police zone then became a host site in the terms of the civic component of the police zone, the public safety counts as they were called. We had over 240 citizens spread out through all the demographic areas there. There was a set of criteria, integrity, community policing, smart use of technology that the city had already formulated and wanted to get opinions on. And then there were questions about what the citizens expected from their police chief, and equally important, what they were willing to do for their police chief. The results of that were compelling, and in part because the expert panel at that time was actually the screening committee that would help recommend the police chief selection. And so the screening committee could see the work that the citizens were doing on this and the responsibility they took in their discussions and in their questions, and the citizens could see the diversity and engagement of the screening committee. The result was not only did we get an excellent police chief, but we legitimized the process by which that police chief was chosen.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you do a deliberative democracy on a topic that is very, very divisive, I know you've done these on abortion. What's the goal? Is the goal to move people, or is the goal to simply inform people, or is the goal maybe to both inform and let people talk to each other?
So it is the case that my current sort of center that I work under is called the Center for Ethics and Policy. And under the area of ethics writ large, the concerns of our particular program for deliberative democracy have addressed climate change, same-sex marriage, and the issue of abortion. Those fall traditionally in some of the areas that we could call ethics, future generations, rights and relationships and such. We want those discussions to have some kind of influence on policy. And we found that one way to sort of refine both the background information and the setting in which the discussions will take place is to run these on our campuses, and we call these campus conversations. And community college has been great here in Philadelphia to actually have honed their experience with campus conversations and even taken them to the level of statewide conversations. One of the ways that we do that is through what I call a beta test. And we try to run these on our campuses. We vet the expert panel who's invited. We see how the participants are reacting to the material. That gives us a comfort level then when we want to move out to, in these cases here, a statewide deliberation with a real random sample of the population. So we see our relationship with Community College of Philadelphia as collegial and as actually critical to this whole process. The talent and pool of people that the campus has, the ability for the campus and its under its various leadership structures, including Center for Law and Society, have in fact created the quality control that's necessary to make these events work. On one level, the design of these protocols is simple. It's the implementation that's challenging. And there's where experience and care is absolutely required. And with that, we have a great confidence that the outcomes of a real citizen deliberation hosted at a campus like this will contribute to a real discussion of public policy in the state legislature. And I should say, within regard to the issue of abortion, it's not going to be a conversation about the metaphysical status of the fetus. We want it to be a problem to work on. The problem that they're going to work on is a comparison of clinic regulations between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And those are very clear regulations, and we'll have people roll up their sleeves and work on that. And the results of this will be, in fact, handed to certain representatives in our state legislature.
Now, I wanted to go and dig down into the history of this process.
Right.
Originally, these kind of deliberative discussions came out of life and death decisions people were making in hospitals.
Well, here's what I would argue, that the Federalist Papers, which is our political philosophy, and especially the sort of Madisonian concerns within there, actually contain the seeds for an interpretation of our Constitution and our democracy itself as being deliberative. We didn't, in the original Constitution, select our senators. They were selected by state legislatures based upon a certain kind of person that you wanted to be in the Senate, capable of deliberation in a deep and thoughtful way. We didn't select our presidents. That was the Electoral College. You wanted to select people for the Electoral College that were people who could discern the broader picture and choose people capable of the kind of leadership that the Greeks would have appreciated in terms of the virtues of citizenship and broad and decisive practical wisdom. So one might argue that the original intent of our Constitution was to create a deliberative democracy. That I would go that far back and then take it currently to our sort of current iteration of democracy, which my colleague Mickey Edwards, Republican congressman, once has in a book titled The Parties versus the People, and how to turn Democrats and Republicans back into Americans. We are, in a certain sense, retrieving the original intent of our Constitution. But the philosophical grandfather of modern deliberative democracy is a German named Jürgen Habermas. And he had a model of practical reason that he embedded as coming out of dialogue. Instead of a monologue with oneself, you need to have a conversation with others. There, the context of an ethics committee in a hospital setting can help us, can inform us. If you had hard cases brought to ethics committees and you had nothing but surgeons on them, you would have very different hospital policy. So it's important to compose institutional review boards and ethics committees in hospitals as with people from hospital administration, from patient advocate, from the doctors, from the nurses. It's the multiple perspectives to be brought upon the problem that will give you a better way of managing and thinking through the problem. When you move from applied ethics to applied political philosophy, you're moving to deliberative democracy more proper. And that's what we've been able to do. And I should say we've been able to do it in the city of Pittsburgh to the point where Pittsburgh is now becoming a center for deliberative democracy.
And your hope is that with the Community College of Philadelphia, we'll be doing the same thing here.
It seems to me that the very practical way in which this can be instantiated within city government through the redesign of town hall meetings and the fulfillment of public comment requirements makes it something that ought to be transferable. And if we can do it in Pittsburgh, we can do it in Philadelphia. And I see the Community College of Philadelphia and the work that's being done here as a natural starting point. And we want to work very closely with Kathy and others to see if we can make that transition and transfer the knowledge.
Now, if somebody watching this really wanted to get deeper into this or maybe participate in one of these deliberations, how could they do that? How could an individual get involved?
So for a number of years, there have been many grassroots organizations, and some of them are quite sophisticated. And so doing a web search, a Google search, for example, on everyday democracy, you'll find a very good organization in Connecticut. If you do the Center for Deliberative Democracy, you'll come to Jim Fishkin's work out in Stanford University. In Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, is the home site for what's called the Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. They have over 3,000 members. And by going to that, you can have all kinds of toolkits on how to run these, how to set these up. National Issues Forum in Ohio has been doing this for 35 years. It is a frustration for some in the community that this kind of work has not yet been seen by people like Joel Scarsborough in The Morning with Joe or David Brooks in the New York Times. People who say, how can we make our democracy stronger? There actually are tools and there are practitioners there. We're hoping that not only can we make Pittsburgh a center for deliberative democracy and raise the consciousness of this process within our own city, but we'd like to see the state of Pennsylvania also be seen as a center for deliberative democracy and therefore go from city to legislature and perhaps eventually to Congress and the Senate.
It is very, very exciting, this whole idea that there is really maybe a historic antecedent to what you're trying to do today. But as much fun as it is to talk about all this, we're really reaching the end of our time. Professor, I want to thank you so much for sharing not only your story here, but sharing your work with the Community College of Philadelphia.
It's my pleasure, and this is important work we're all doing. Thank you.
Great. And I want to thank everyone who has been watching. You've been watching the Perspective series of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society. I'm David Trevaskis, an adjunct professor here in the Paralegal Studies program of the Community College of Philadelphia. We will see you next time on CCP TV.